Your loved one dies peacefully in their sleep. Or so you believe. No signs of struggle, no alarms raised. But what if their death wasn't natural? What if a killer had been walking into homes, smothering victims with a pillow, and slipping away unnoticed for years? This is the terrifying story of Billy Chemirmir, the serial murderer who turned trust into his deadliest weapon. The room was silent, unnaturally so. The air was still, heavy with the lingering scent of old furniture and the faint perfume of someone who had lived there for decades. Carolyn McPhee, an elderly woman living alone in Plano, Texas, lay motionless on the floor of her bedroom. Her eyes, once filled with life, stared blankly at the ceiling. There were no signs of forced entry, no indications of a struggle. The house was undisturbed, as if nothing had happened. When her sons arrived after their calls went unanswered, they found their mother cold and lifeless. The police responded swiftly, but their conclusion was routine. Another elderly woman had succumbed to natural causes. It should have ended there. But something was missing. Carolyn never took off her wedding ring, a symbol of a lifelong commitment, yet it was gone. Other pieces of jewelry she cherished had also disappeared. Her sons raised concerns, but authorities dismissed their suspicions. It wasn't uncommon for the elderly to misplace valuables, they were told. No signs of foul play meant no further investigation. 3 months passed, and another quiet home in the same city became the scene of something far more sinister. At a senior living community in Plano, Mary Bartell, a 90-year-old resident, lay motionless in her bed. She had been found unresponsive by staff who assumed the worst. But unlike Carolyn, Mary wasn't dead. She was unconscious. And when she finally awoke in the hospital, she told a story that would unravel one of the most chilling crime sprees in Texas history. The memory was fragmented, but the terror was vivid. It started with an insistent knock at the door. Without hesitation, she had moved toward it, expecting nothing more than a visitor or a staff member. The door opened, and in an instant, a shadow pushed its way inside. She never saw his face clearly, but the sensation of his gloved hand covering her mouth, the force pressing her down onto the bed, was seared into her mind. Then, suffocation. A pillow smothered her, cutting off her breath, draining the strength from her body. Darkness closed in. She survived by chance. Unlike the others, she hadn't slipped away completely. And when she regained consciousness, she discovered what had been taken. Not just her peace, not just her sense of security, but the same thing that had vanished from Carolyn McPhee's home. Her wedding ring. It wasn't a coincidence. Detectives began revisiting other deaths in the area, cases that had been closed too quickly. And then, something even more unsettling surfaced. Mary Bartle's next-door neighbour, Anne Conklin, had died the day before. Her death had been ruled natural as well. The pattern was emerging. Elderly women living alone, dying in their homes without any obvious cause. Jewellery missing. The disappearances of sentimental, valuable items were dismissed, but the truth was darker than theft. In the background, someone was watching. A predator who understood the system. He didn't need to break down doors or use weapons that left a trace. He didn't need to make noise. He knew that the quiet death of an old woman wouldn't raise suspicion, and for a long time, it didn't. But every criminal makes a mistake. In this case, the mistake was a car, a Nissan Altima. A resident's son had noticed a man loitering in the parking lot near the senior community for an unusual amount of time. When questioned, the man claimed he was waiting for a medical appointment. Something about the response didn't sit right, so the resident's son did something that would change the course of the investigation. He wrote down the car's license plate. The plate led police to a man named Billy Chemirmir, and Billy Chemirmir was far from an ordinary suspect. The investigation shifted immediately. The name Billy Chemirmir wasn't unknown to law enforcement. He had been arrested before. Nothing particularly alarming, just minor infractions. But there was something about him, something unsettling that now demanded scrutiny. Chemirmir was a Kenyan immigrant who had been in the US since the early 2000s. He had a history of trespassing in senior living communities, often pretending to be a maintenance worker or a healthcare aide. In 2016, he had been arrested for unlawfully entering a retirement home, impersonating medical staff. At the time, it was seen as an isolated incident, a desperate attempt at theft. But now, with a growing number of elderly women dying mysteriously, investigators began to wonder if that arrest had been a warning, one that had been ignored. For days, detectives monitored Chemirmir's movements, trailing him as he drove from one residential area to another. He was cautious, but not paranoid. He had been doing this for years after all. He had studied his victims, knew their routines, and understood how easy it was to walk into their lives without raising suspicion. Then, a break in the case. On March 20th, 2018, officers followed Chemirmir as he pulled into an apartment complex. He left his car and disappeared inside for several minutes. When he re-emerged, he carried nothing. But just before getting back into his car, he approached a dumpster and tossed something inside. Police moved in. As Chemirmir drove away, officers retrieved the discarded item, a small red jewelry box. When they opened it, they found what would become the crucial piece of evidence: a collection of rings, bracelets, and necklaces, each belonging to a woman who days or weeks earlier had been declared dead. One piece stood out: a bracelet, delicate yet worn, engraved with a name. Luthi Harris. Harris, 81 years old, had been found dead in her home just days earlier. At the time, nothing seemed unusual. She was elderly, living alone. Her passing had been assumed natural. No autopsy had been conducted. But now, faced with undeniable evidence, police revisited her home. This time, they searched with the knowledge that they weren't looking at an accident of old age. The house was still. It hadn't been disturbed since she had died. But near her bed, a single pillow lay slightly out of place. It wasn't much, just a subtle imprint, a barely visible smudge of lipstick. But it was enough, a pillow. The simplest, most untraceable murder weapon. No blood, no noise, no resistance, just silence. Chemirmir was taken into custody. At first, he was calm, too calm. When questioned, he denied everything. He laughed, he shrugged, he claimed he had bought the jewelry from someone else, that he had no connection to these deaths. But investigators had more than just the jewelry. They had his phone. Data extracted from Chemirmir's device painted a damning picture. GPS locations placed him near multiple victims' homes in the hours or days before their deaths. Search history revealed chilling queries. How to smother someone with a pillow. How to kill an old person quickly. How to tell if someone is dead. And then there was the notebook. Inside Chemirmir's apartment, police discovered a small worn notebook filled with names, addresses, and notes. Women's names. Elderly women. Many of them already dead. This wasn't impulse. This wasn't opportunity. This was planning. For years, Chemirmir had hunted his victims with patience and precision. He didn't need weapons or brute force. He used deception, blending into a world where people trusted caregivers and workers in uniform. He understood the flaws in the system, how quick authorities were to assume an elderly person had simply passed away in their sleep. He had relied on that assumption, and for a long time, it had worked. But now, the pieces were falling into place. And what investigators began to realize was even more horrifying than they had initially imagined, because Luthi Harris wasn't his first victim. She was one of many. The list of names in Billy Chemirmir's notebook was longer than anyone had expected. What had first seemed like a handful of suspicious deaths quickly spiraled into something far more disturbing. Detectives began re-examining cases that had once been dismissed as natural deaths. The more they looked, the clearer the pattern became. Women, all elderly, all living alone or in retirement communities, all with jewelry missing after their deaths, and all with no apparent cause of death, just the assumption that time had caught up with them. One of those names was Mary Brooks. On January 31st, 2018, Brooks had been found dead in her home. The scene was mundane, almost unremarkable. Grocery bags sat on the counter, as if she had just returned from shopping. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, no screams had been heard. To everyone who knew her, it seemed like a peaceful passing. But one thing stood out in hindsight. She had gone to Walmart just before she died. Security footage from that day was pulled. And there, among the aisles, was a familiar figure. Billy Chemirmir. He had been at the same store at the same time, watching her. Not long after, another video surfaced. This time, it showed Chemirmir leaving the Walmart parking lot. Minutes later, Brooks' own car pulled out, heading home. She was unaware that she had a shadow. When detectives placed him at the scene of so many unexplained deaths, it was no longer a matter of coincidence. Chemirmir wasn't just following these women, he was hunting them. Investigators pieced together his method. He would enter retirement communities, blending in as a maintenance worker or health aide. He targeted women who were alone, vulnerable, and unlikely to have visitors often. Once inside, he waited for the perfect moment. A gentle knock, an innocent smile. The moment the door opened, it was over. He didn't need weapons. He didn't need force. He only needed a pillow. Suffocation left no bruises, no blood, no broken bones. The elderly were fragile, their deaths expected. Most of the time, the victims' families were too consumed with grief to question anything. And Chemirmir relied on that silence. But even the most meticulous killers make mistakes. Had Mary Bartell not survived, had her wedding ring not been missing, had a single son not thought to write down a license plate, he might have continued undetected. Instead, the floodgates opened. When police confronted Chemirmir with the evidence, his demeanor changed. The confidence wavered, but only slightly. He denied everything, called it a misunderstanding. He insisted that the jewelry in his possession had been purchased legally, that the locations on his phone were coincidences. But coincidences don't kill 22 people. As more families were contacted, the true extent of the crimes came to light. Women who had died months or even years earlier were now part of an active homicide investigation. Some had been cremated, their remains making forensic analysis impossible. Others had been buried, their deaths never questioned. The families were left to process a reality more horrifying than they could have imagined. The person they had mourned, whose funerals they had attended, hadn't simply passed in their sleep. They had been murdered. For years, Chemirmir had walked through their homes, pressed pillows against their faces, stolen their most treasured belongings, and slipped away without anyone noticing. It was no longer a question of whether he was guilty. It was a question of how many more victims had gone unnoticed. Billy Chemirmir thought he had found the perfect crime. No evidence, no suspicion, just a string of elderly victims whose deaths were quietly brushed aside. But in the end, one survivor, one missing wedding ring, and one sharp-eyed witness were enough to tear his perfect illusion apart. What do you think? How many killers might still be out there, hiding behind the same assumptions? Could crimes like this happen again, slipping through the cracks of a flawed system? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you found this story as chilling as we did, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more true crime cases that reveal the dark truths hidden in plain sight. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, stay aware, stay vigilant, and remember, evil often wears a friendly face.